The purpose of this video is to help you understand how to get from basic earnings per share to diluted earnings per share. So we're going to take each of these four scenarios that are on your screen independently, because these are things that it could be potentially converted to common shares. It just hasn't happened yet. So the goal of the exercise when we're trying to report diluted earnings per share is we're telling the reader if all of these instruments that we have outstanding convert to common shares, which is a feature in the instrument, then this is how bad this earnings per share will look. So for example, if we have convertible bonds, we're going to have to look at the interest, and we'll add that back to the numerator because we wouldn't have had the bonds. We're pretending like they converted on January 1st, and then we'll figure out how many shares we would have to issue if the people converted them. Preferred stock, the same thing. We always back out the preferred dividend when we do our basic calculation. So if we assume everybody converted January 1st, well, now we don't have to back it out. So you would simply add it back in or not back it out, depending on how you're doing your calculation, then add the new common shares. And then I'll talk about these stock options and warrants and unvested restricted stock as well. So these exercises are from your class pack. Let's start with the first one, BE 2139. This is about bonds. So if a company has 100,000 of 8% convertible bonds due in 5 years, each $1,000 convertible bond is convertible into 40 shares of common stock. So let's figure out first how many shares of common stock we would have to issue. So I'm going to take I have 100,000 in bonds. That's what's on my balance sheet. They're in $1,000 increments. Okay, so I've got 100 bonds outstanding. Each of those bonds can convert into 40 shares. So if I multiply the 100 times 40, this means I would have to issue 4,000 common shares. So let's start with just doing our normal earnings per share calculation. And I'm going to create a column for the numerator and a column for the denominator. Setting up these problems can be the best way to help you sort through them, especially as we get to some of the hairier ones. So start with net income, right? And that is telling us it's 640,000. Let me turn on those commas. And initially, let's see, how many shares do we have outstanding? 250,000. So our basic EPS is simply that net income divided by the shares. So that number is going to be $2.56. So that's our basic EPS. Actually, you know what? I'm going to change my label right here, basic EPS. Now, to get to diluted EPS, let's take this bonds and figure out what's happening with it. So for the bond, I've got to do something to the numerator, because if these bonds had converted January 1st, I would never had to pay the interest on it. So I'm going to calculate what that interest expense was. I have 100,000 on the balance sheet, and they are at 8%. So the interest would have been $8,000, but I'm not done yet. And this is something we really only do for bonds. We don't have to do it for the preferred stock dividends. I've got to also tax affect it. Because the tax rate is 25%, that expense will actually shrink because I would have had a tax benefit. So by taking 75% of that answer, I'm getting the after-tax impact of the bonds. Since it's an expense, and I want to pretend like the expense never happened, to get to my diluted numerator, I will add that back. Now on the denominator side, again, we've got to figure out how many shares are we issuing. And we did that above already. So remember, we said we have 100,000 in bonds. Let's do this again. 100,000 in bond. Each bond is valued at $1,000, right? So when somebody holds a certificate, they're in $1,000 increments. So there's 100 certificates outstanding. It told us that we will give 40 shares of common stock for every one bond. So if I have 100 bonds, and I give everybody 40 shares, I'm going to end up with 4,000 additional shares of stock. So I'm going to add that to my initial number. Now I have an updated diluted numerator and denominator, and I can simply do the exact same math I did before, and I'm now at 254. Two keys I want you to remember here. One, if for any reason this number we calculated in diluted had been better, meaning, ooh, this is more money, then I would ignore it. Then basic and diluted would be the same number, but we can see it's worse. Oh, sad news. Dilute, if everybody turned in their bonds, we would only have $2.54 in earnings per share. So because that's lower, that is the number we'll report. All right, the other thing I want you to remember with bonds is you've got to tax affect that interest. It's a really easy one to forget. All right, now let's compare that to convertible preferred. I'm going to do exercise 2140. So let's start with what we know about basic. So they have net income of $48,000. So again, I'm just setting up this problem the exact same way. I've got my numerator, I've got my denominator. And does it tell us how many shares? We had 10,000 shares of common stock outstanding during the year. Okay. It's nice of them to give that to us. We don't have to do any of our extra weighting that we normally do. So I will divide the numerator by the denominator, and I'm at $4.80. But I've got this preferred stock, and it's convertible. So we have 10,000 shares of common and 1,000 shares of non-cumulative preferred stock. Don't forget, if it's non-cumulative, we have to declare the dividend to deal with it in this diluted calculation. If it's cumulative, I will always put 1 year's worth in my calculation. I will ignore anything in arrears. Doesn't matter whether it's been declared or not. But this is non-cumulative. So we have 1,000 shares of non-cumulative, each convertible into 5 shares of common stock. So let's update our denominator. We have 1,000 shares, non-cumulative, and they each can get 5 shares of stock. Let's make sure that they actually did declare a dividend during the year. They declared and paid $5,000 in preferred dividends. Oh, you know what? I actually should have updated this for the basic as well. So I'm going to put that $5,000 here so you can see it. I'm going to make one more adjustment before we get to basic. So with basic, remember, basic EPS is always the amount available to common shareholders. So I need to subtract out any dividend that I have given of my earnings to the preferred shareholders. So I have an updated numerator of 43,000. That is the basic number. For preferred, well, if I had issued all those shares, these 5,000 additional shares of stock, then I would not have had to pay that dividend. So I'll add the dividend back, and it goes, and really you just end up straight back at wherever your net income number was in basic. So I'm going to add it back. I'm at 48,000 for my numerator, and then I'll add the shares in because I'm pretending that this has happened, and now my earnings per share is, let's expand this, $3.20. Okay, this is good news. Well, I don't know if it's good news, but it's lower. So again, this is our diluted number, and this is our basic number. So you can see the mistake I made at the beginning that I caught when I started updating to get to my diluted was I had forgotten to take out that preferred dividend for my basic. I add it back to get to diluted because I'm assuming everybody converted it. Okay, let's go over to the stock options. Let's see. Why is it not showing up? Okay. It looks like for some reason it is not showing up. So I will make a separate video for the stock options. But again, we've covered now bonds and preferred stock. Don't forget that net of tax, right? With preferred stock, don't forget we have to pay attention to whether it's cumulative or non-cumulative. And we also need to deal with it in the basic calculation.